and to stabilise the transatlantic relationship, which has been severely tested.
Again, the relationship's been very special with France and very special with this gentleman on my right.
It looked like the old le bromance between these two was back, but the differences weren't far from the surface, notably on the relative contributions to Ukraine from the US and Europe.
Europe is loaning the money to Ukraine. They get their money back.
No, in fact, to be frank, we paid 60% of the total effort, and it was through, like the US, loans, guarantee, grants, and we provided real money, to be clear.
But Donald Trump continues to insist Ukraine hands over half its key natural resources as compensation for America's contribution. And he says such a deal with Ukraine's President Zelensky is close.
I will be meeting with President Zelensky. In fact, he may come in this week or next week to sign the agreement, and which would be nice. I'd love to meet him. Would meet at the Oval Office.
That issue of compensation is another bone of contention between the US and Europe. It was up to Russia, said the French president, to pay.
This war costed all of us a lot of money. And this is the responsibility of Russia, because the aggressor is Russia.
Where some agreement appears to be emerging is on the question of possible European peacekeeping troops in Ukraine after a truce, something both France and the UK are open to.
Is France going to lift the block on the
Because he's not, look, if we do this deal, he's not looking for more war. He doesn't mind, but I've specifically asked him that question. He has no problem with it.
Is France going to lift the block on the $300 billion in frozen Russian assets in Belgium? France has opposed unfreezing it to pay Ukraine and compensate the U.S. for its support. Is France going to lift its opposition to that?
This is, we speak about frozen assets. We already used them to back precisely the loans negotiated at the G7. And it's part of the sanctions, so it will depend on the follow-up of the discussions. But clearly, we respect international law. It's just frozen assets now. You can take the proceeds of the frozen assets, but you cannot take the assets themselves because it's not respecting international law, and we want to respect international law.
How is one different than the other? If you can take the proceeds from it, how can you not take
Because it's very different. You keep the assets, you take the proceeds because they are paralyzed in a certain way. You take the proceeds during the wartime. But you keep the assets, and it's part of the negotiation at the end of the war. Because, this war costed all of us a lot of money. And this is the responsibility of Russia, because the aggressor is Russia.
Should the US be compensated?
So at the end of the day, this frozen asset should be part of the negotiation, all in all.
Will France support the US being compensated?
I support the idea to have Ukraine first being compensated, because they are the ones to have lose a lot of their fellow citizens and being destroyed by these attacks. Second, all of those who paid for could be compensated, but not by Ukraine, by Russia, because they were the one to aggress.
Again, just so you understand, Europe is loaning the money to Ukraine. They get their money back.
No, in fact, to be frank, we paid 60% of the total effort, and it was through, like the US, loans, guarantee, grants, and we provided real money, to be clear.
Yeah.
We have 230 billion frozen assets in Europe, Russian assets, but this is not as a collateral of a loan, because this is not our belonging.
Or not so cordial, as both men did the clasp and yank handshake, an attempt to demonstrate male dominance. At the customary fireside photo op, both men were trying to give the impression that any divisions over Ukraine could easily be resolved.
I'm here as a friend because through centuries we've been friends, and we are personal friends, as you mentioned it, because we work very well together. And I think the US and France always stands on the same side, the right side, I would say, of history.
Mm-hmm. The deal for America to exploit Ukraine's mineral resources as payment for military aid is apparently near completion.
I will be meeting with President Zelensky. In fact, he may come in this week or next week to sign the agreement, and which would be nice. I'd love to meet him. Would meet at the Oval Office. So the agreement's being worked on now. They're very close to a final deal. It'll be a deal with rare earths and various other things, and he would like to come, as I understand it, here to sign it, and that would be great with me.
And maybe a trip to Moscow to see his friend Vladimir Putin.
If this all gets settled out, which I think it will, sure, I would go there, sure. And he'd come here, too.
Today in Kyiv, President Zelensky and his wife were marking the 3-year anniversary of the Russian invasion. Ukraine never says how many soldiers have been killed, but it's believed to be more than 100,000. A dozen European leaders were there to show their continued support. A video conference enabled President Trump and President Macron in Washington to hear a direct appeal from President Zelensky.
Our teams are already working productively with the U.S. on economic agreement, which we hope to sign in Washington. And President Trump, we would really like to hear from you, because all our people, all our families are very worried. Will there be support from America?
Other Western leaders see Mr. Trump's refusal to condemn President Putin for invading Ukraine as a potential license for China to invade Taiwan, or any other leader to eye up some tempting real estate.
A free and sovereign Ukraine is not only in the European interest, but it is in the interest of the whole world. Because the autocrats around the world are watching very carefully whether there's any impunity if you violate international borders or invade your neighbor, or if there is true deterrence.
The Prime Minister, due in Washington later this week, was announcing more sanctions on Russia, even as President Trump would like to lift those already in place.
So today we're announcing the UK's largest packet of sanctions since the early days of the war, going after Russia's shadow fleet and going after companies in China and elsewhere who are sending military components.
In Semibratovo, population 6,000 northeast of Moscow, they've erected a monument to the 11 young men the village has lost in Ukraine. Cemeteries across Russia tell the story. Maybe twice as many Russian as Ukrainian soldiers have been killed in 3 years of war. As yet, there is little protest, even if some Russians may silently wonder what they're fighting for. Today in Moscow, President Putin was receiving a sword and shield from the Grand Mufti, the leader of Russia's Muslims. The Russian president has made sure that he has the support of the country's religious leaders. And he's clear that talks with President Trump will not stop him from continuing to attack Ukraine.
We're ready to negotiate with both Ukraine and Europe, with any representatives who, in the spirit of goodwill, would like to help achieve peace. But we will only stop military operations only when these negotiations produce a firm, sustainable result that will be acceptable to the Russian Federation.
Sure enough, over the weekend, Russia unleashed waves of drone and missile attacks across Ukraine. Many of Ukraine's air defenses are provided by the US, but for how much longer?